Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to Searching for Dragons. I'm Snappy and I'm joined by my co-host and good friend Graham. How are you, Graham?
Oh, I'm really excited for this one.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun one. We're going to get dark and evil today, right? With our man, Charles Baudelaire. So before I start to get into my presentation, I wanted to ask you, what do you know of Baudelaire? What are you coming into this with?
I honestly know very little about Baudelaire, one of those writers who I know other writers cite him as an influence, but I'm not really familiar with his work per se,
Right. Yeah. So
or his life, really.
Yeah, so this is going to be a nice learning experience for you. I had known about Baudelaire for a while just because of how shocking some of his stuff was seen, and he had his main poetry collection was such an interesting title, "The Flowers of Evil." So I remember reading that back in university and not sure how to take it, and I kind of put him back in of my head. And then when I was engaging with this work with Dr. Allan and watching his channel, Lady Babylon, he started quoting and bringing up Charles Baudelaire quite often as an example of one of these dragon type artistes, someone who really is engaged in this magical practice and is invoking the spirit of the muse, which is kind of these are the people we're looking for to highlight in our podcast. So I thought this was the
Yeah,
perfect kind of person, right? Because as we've seen in previous episodes, for those who haven't joined us before, the whole idea of this show is to try and find those people who have engaged life in this kind of magical way, in the approach creation and art through that lens of trying to be this magical creative person and transform themselves and society, with sort of our quintessential figure being Antonin Artaud, right?
yeah,
And
exactly.
Baudelaire is going to be really interesting. Before we get into him, I want to talk a little bit about some of his philosophy of poetry and stuff, like, because it really related to Artaud. And now I'm almost certain that Artaud would have read Baudelaire, would have engaged Baudelaire, and
If
that's
I
specific.
recall, if I recall, I read that he read Baudelaire as
Okay, so then for
Poe,
sure.
as well as a lot of Poe.
Right, exactly. So that's the other thing is that Baudelaire is like, if there's a Poe stan, it's Baudelaire, the biggest Poe stan of all time, and we will get into that. It's almost to the point of absurdity. It's beautiful actually, but the really interesting concept that Baudelaire has that has to do with his personal philosophy is this idea of homo duplex, or the man and his double, which should immediately, to those who are familiar with Baudelaire, Artaud, scream the theater in his double, right?
Yeah,
And Baudelaire really saw this. He kind of created like an axis for people between this, what he calls like the spleen, which is like harsh, depressive reality, and the ideal, or sometimes he'll use terms like animality and spirituality. And he thought that the defining factor of man was this experience of original sin, which was the coming into creation, and that it was this purpose of man was to confront these two extremes, this drive to evil and this drive to idealism. And he felt that beauty was the key to the balance of this, and that beauty would allow you to navigate between the evil and the ideal, or the spleen and the ideal. So very, very Artaud in his approach to this. You can see like Artaud takes it even further, but it stood out to me, and I wanted people to understand that kind of aspect of his work and his personal philosophy. He's really influenced by this idea of the fall and of coming into creation and being denigrated and having to really confront the self and confront morality and beauty and eroticism and kind of try to form a balance. The goal for him was to create this perfect balance of a human being who was both present in modernity able to handle change and accept the present, but also was striving for this idealistic goal of transformation. So it's really kind of intense and beautiful, and I loved it, and it was just so magical. So we'll get started here. This is our man, Baudelaire. As you can see, he kind of does look like Poe, right? If you slap the mustache on him, wouldn't you look like Poe?
Yeah, I see it.
Right? And I wanted to start with this quote, which I thought was very evocative of our whole project here, which is, he says, "To handle a language skillfully is to practice a kind of evocative sorcery." So Baudelaire was very aware of the magic that he was doing, and he was trying to transform his society. And he was trying to force people to create a whole self, to confront the double, to confront evil, and through the confrontation of evil, arrive at the ideal and come to true beauty. All right, so these are Baudelaire's parents. And Baudelaire was born in Paris. I'm just going to bring up my notes, sorry. So Baudelaire was born in Paris on April 9th in 1821. And on the left there is his father, who's Jean-François. And on the right is his mother, Caroline. And Jean-François was a much older man. He was a widower at the time, and he was 61. And Caroline, when she got pregnant with Baudelaire, was only 21. And she was kind of like this poor orphan who really, this was a marriage of like necessity. There was some love there. Like we do know that Caroline really did love her first husband, but it was a marriage of convenience, And Baudelaire was born and baptized at this particular church here, which was the Saint Sulpice Church. And I wanted to show this because this is an image that was really important to Baudelaire. He really identified with the high architecture of Paris and the Parisian surroundings, and it was hugely important to him. His father didn't live very long, though, and he wound up passing away a few years later when Baudelaire was only 6 years old, and his mother remarried to this particular man, who is Joseph Opic, in 1828. Now, Joseph Opic is kind of a high society aristocrat. Okay, he's he's like a diplomat. He worked for the crown, very, very prestigious person. And Baudelaire was absolutely devastated when his mother remarried. He was very much, in a lot of the biographies I read, made a huge deal about this kind of Oedipal complex that Baudelaire would have with his mother his whole life. He was constantly seeking her approval. He saw her as his greatest and only love. He was constantly like wanting her attention and wanting her approval, even as he spurned it. And he always would tell her, like, if you give me money, if you give me more stuff, that's the best way to show me your approval. It was like this weird juxtaposition he had with her. But his whole life is really defined by this deep hatred for this man, Opic. And as we go on, we'll see how deep this hatred goes. And in Opic's defense, he really did kind of embrace Baudelaire and try. He was a stern, kind of aloof figure in his life, but so were a lot of fathers at that time. And he did provide him with a ton of money and a ton of support, even as Baudelaire continuously spurned him. But we'll get into that later. So a few years after they get married, the family relocated to Lyon, and Baudelaire was sent to go to boarding school. And this was the beginning, like this really devastated him, because now Opic had separated him from his mother, separated him from his beloved Paris, and brought him to Lyon, to this place that he felt was this like super backwards, racist, bigoted, laughable city. Like he has nothing nice to say about the people of Lyon. Eventually, Baudelaire winds up graduating from school, and he gets into the Lycée Louis le Grand in 18, and he goes there and he does really well in his studies at first. But Baudelaire is kind of one of these impassioned people When it's a subject he likes, like literature, he thrives and people are entirely blown away. But when it's something he's not interested in, you can't get him to do shit. You cannot get him to do anything. And this kind of idleness and refusal to work on anything that is not passion inducing is a constant theme throughout his life. He's either in these modes of like passionate exuberance and engagement, or he's entirely removed. There's very like, he's such a black and white figure. And in school at this time, by the time he gets to the last grade, he's lost all respect and he's kind of totally checked out, to the point where he eventually gets expelled. And Joseph Opique is forced to pay for a tutor to private homeschool him for the last year. And he winds up graduating in 1839. And at this point, Opique is really trying to pressure him into becoming like a lawyer, a man of letters. You know, he's like, you loved literature, you studied literature, this is a good compromise. Your stepbrother is also a lawyer. And Baudelaire's like, no, I refuse. I'm going to go into literature. And he winds up going into literature even against Opique's wishes. And he winds up taking like private, he tells his family that he's going to go get private literary schooling in Paris. And they give him a bunch of his inheritance, but he doesn't go to school. Okay. Baudelaire winds up just becoming a lech at this time, and a notorious kind of, he becomes basically like a dandy, or in the French, they would say a flâneur, which is like a man about town, or someone who strides about the town. And he really engages in this kind of libertine lifestyle that was kind of common, that wasn't common, was coming out at this time in Paris. You know, this is a time of wild exuberance and of the birth of like this individuality. And Paris is kind of like this high art place, the place of new cultural ideas, new cultural modes. And he relishes in this and throws himself into it. He does every drug he could get his hands on. At this time, he winds up coming down with a couple different STDs. He starts putting up his inheritance as like debt collateral. So he says, I'm going to get this money in the future. So you give me money now, and then I'll pay you back once I get my inheritance. And when his family gets word of this, they flip the heck out. And then Joseph Opique decides he has to put his foot down. And he's like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to send you on a life-changing journey to India. I'm going to put you on a boat. We're going to get you out of Paris, which we think is the problem. You know, you're engaged in all this ridiculousness because of the Parisian lifestyle. So maybe if we take you out and force you to work on a ship and experience the world, it will change you. It did not change Baudelaire. It did not change Baudelaire one bit. In fact, Baudelaire hated this entire trip. He resented it. And he writes a lot about his experiences on the boat going to India. And what ends up happening is he's so desperate to get out of this situation and to go back to Paris that when the boat lands in the islands of Mauritius, he takes off. He runs away. He winds up meeting up with this rich family in Paris, and he endears himself to them, and they put him up with room and board. And he spends the next 2 months on the island of Mauritius waiting around for a boat that'll take him back to France. And at this time, he becomes really kind of, you know, he falls really for this Creole woman, this mixed race woman here. This is a portrait of her. Her name is Otard de Bragar. Also, excuse me if I'm saying any of these words wrong to our French audience. We're doing our best. French is not a language either of us are very familiar with. We're more familiar with Quebecois, and even that we butcher. So please, I mean no disrespect, you know, nothing but love. So Bragar is becomes this like the first muse in Baudelaire's life. And this is when he first starts to engage in kind of poetry. You know, prior to this, he was just this rampant reader and this obsessive literary, like when he was living that kind of libertine lifestyle in France, it wasn't just drugs and sex, it was also literature. He read all of the great romantics, especially people like Byron and all of that English literature, all of this really high romance. He really identified with idealism and imagination. And when he meets her, he sees her as this imagination figure, as this figure who can really inspire him to beauty. And I wanted to show you this poem that gets later published, but it was written while he was here in the island of Mauritius. So this is to a Creole lady. It says, "In the perfumed country which the sun caresses, I knew under a canopy of crimson trees and palms from which indolence reigns into your eyes, a Creole lady whose charms were unknown. Her complexion is pale and warm. The dark enchantress affects a noble air with the movements of her neck. Tall and slender, she walks like a huntress. Her smile is calm and her eye confident. If you went, madame, to the true land of glory, on the banks of the Seine, or along the green lore, beauty fit to ornament those ancient manners you'd make in the shelter of those shady retreats. 1,000 sonnets grow in the hearts of poets, whom your large eyes would make more subject than your slaves."
Beautiful.
So, really identifying her with this kind of goddess figure, this powerful Aphrodite that enslaves the hearts of men, and drawing this kind of comparison between her being this rich, affluent slave owner and that goddess figure. Kind of intense, right? And he's writing this at like 21 years old, just to put that into perspective. He's also on the island of Mauritius. He sees a lot of he's confronted with a lot of his first experiences of evil. There's an image that really haunts him at this time where he witnesses these sailors slowly torture and then consume alive a albatross. And this is something he eventually writes a poem about it. I didn't include it. It's really, really dark though, and I recommend that everyone engage with it. But what ends up happening is he winds up getting onto a boat and making his way back to Paris, and it takes him several months. And an interesting thing, though, before I move on with this Auteur de Bragar, this woman, at one point he sends for her to come visit him in Paris, and she decides to come in around 1957, the same year that he goes to publish Le Fleur de Mal, and she dies on the boat ride over and never makes it, right before the book gets published. And wow. This is something that really shocked and hurt him deeply. He felt like she died for his art. He's such a passion figure, right? So he arrives back in France by 1940. And by 1941, he's really even more so engaging in this kind of really affluent lifestyle of the dandy. He's spending all of his fortune on clothes. He's engaging in all of this high art and theater. He starts really he frequents this place a lot called the Theater de Panthéon. And while he's at this theater, this is where he meets his second muse. And this is a disputed photograph, but it's one that I saw in several biographies and whatnot, so I wanted to include it. It's probably not actually Jean Duval, but this is a drawing here that he did of Jean Duval. Not how you pronounce it. But this was a woman who was from Haitian background, and he absolutely would be obsessed with her for his whole life. He winds up, they have this really impassioned love affair right away. He saw her in this play in which she only gives one line, but he was obsessed with her and starts writing her letters, and they begin this courtship. And because he's kind of like this rich dandy, he decides he's going to put her up as his mistress, which is something that a lot of rich men did at this time. So he bought her an apartment near to him and would lavish her in gifts. And famously, they would drink and consume tons of wine and laudanum and hashish together and engage in all-night sexcapades. And he was totally enamored with her. He thought her dancing was this extraordinarily poetic thing. And he saw her as like the ultimate form of both debauchery and beauty, kind of embodied into a single figure. Like just wild. So by 1842, his family's kind of like, sorry, I forgot to show this. Another interesting thing that really enamored, he kept looking for all these signs with her that she was like this muse, goddess kind of figure in his life. And one of these signs was that she lived at Rue de la Femme Sans Tête. So the street with the woman without her head. And this is the statue there of the headless woman. And he saw this as like really evocative of these Greek images of sacrificed muses. And she lived at number 6, which again, he saw as this evil kind of number. And this was a sign that she was this powerful figure in his life, you know? So with him, what ends up happening is he continues in this very debauched kind of way for several years. He engages a lot in the high art society. Like he's always frequenting museums, book releases. He's writing all of the famous artists of his time. He's really engaged in the literary world. And this is a friend of his painted him named Emile Duroy. And this portrait comes in 1844. And this is what Duroy had to say about this piece. He says, "This is Baudelaire posing as Mephistopheles, with his carefully trimmed beard and mustache and the thick black eyebrows, of which one is slightly raised to give a quizzical, sardonic look as he gazes straight at the spectator." You know, so Duroy even saw him as this paradoxical, demonic figure, as someone who is engaged in this debauchery, you know?
Yeah.
So this is when Baudelaire really starts to write prose and starts to become a writer. And he first engages with art criticism. Well, sorry, a really important part at this time is he joins the Society of Hashish Smokers at the Hotel de Piment, which is here. And this is like a very famous literary society where all these people would get together and smoke hash. Like Victor Hugo would have been there, as well as lots of high artists of the French Parisian scene. And at this time, he was also heavily getting into opiates, specifically laudanum. And okay, yeah. So at this time is when he kind of discovers Poe. So this is a really interesting relationship. You know, basically, he was constantly searching for what he considered the highest forms of art, the most beautiful forms of art, the art that spoke to him most of all. And he believed he found this in Edgar Allan Poe, like an absolute kindred spirit. When he read Poe's literature, he writes about how he felt that Poe took words from his mouth, that Poe had said things he meant to say. He felt like entire poems he had dreamed. He looked into his eyes and he felt that they were the same person. In fact, like he saw such a resemblance. He looked at the lifestyle that Poe was living, and it was very reminiscent of his own. And he became absolutely obsessed, to the point where he describes how in the morning when he would rise, right after he prayed to God, he prayed to Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe is alive at this time, but they never managed to correspond, unfortunately, because Poe winds up dying by 1849, a few years later. So this is in 1844, when Baudelaire first discovers and becomes obsessed with Poe. And this is also a really tough time for Baudelaire. This here is a suicide letter that actually recently sold at auction for over 200,000 francs or euros, sorry. And this was a letter he had written and given to Jean Duval, because what happens is his family catches wind of him constantly burning out his inheritance and making debts on future inheritance. So they take him to court and they institute an arbiter who will only allow him to have a stipend of so much money per month. And he can't get any more money. And because of this, like, Jean almost leaves him because he can't afford to keep her up. He can't afford to live his lavish lifestyle with all the drugs and whatnot. And he really identifies with Poe so much that it almost kills him. The melancholy and the depressing nature of Poe's art brings him to a point of near death. And he even describes, though, what's wild is that Poe is also the same thing that gets him out of this. So engaging with Poe is what eventually causes him to come to life again, when he recognizes what he calls one of his true callings and would become something he would do for the rest of his life, which would be attempt to translate the works of Poe into French prose. And at first he only tries to do the short stories because he believes he's not capable of engaging with the poems. The poems are of such perfected high art that him, the lowly worm, which people who read Poe will recognize that image, could never, ever get close to. But this really gets him out of this kind of depressive state. And he decides that he needs to be this art critic and he needs to show the world true art and Poe in particular. And he engages in his next phase of life, which is as an art critic. So in 1845 and in 1846, he starts attending these salons de Paris. Now, the Salon de Paris is like a really famous art exhibit that they would have at the Louvre every year. And at this time, this is the biggest art expedition in the entire world. You know, so high art from all over Europe is coming here, as well as all the French greats. They're being decided by like a panel of the most elite nobles and artists of French high society. And everyone is going to look at these paintings and engage with them. And he decides that it's his duty to be the arbiter. He needs to tell the Parisians what they need to see because he has that true poetic eye, you know? And this is when he finds another figure in his life he considered equal to Poe, but as a painter. And this is the figure of Eugene Delacroix. And this is a painting that Eugene Delacroix did that appeared at the 1845 Salon called The Sultan of Morocco. And here's a line that Baudelaire wrote about Delacroix. Delacroix was passionately in love with passion, but coldly determined to express passion as clearly as possible. And this is really what I identified with, was this imagination. Even though Delacroix was depicting a lot of real scenes, he felt that Delacroix was bringing out this passionate, loving imagery behind his figures, behind the scenery. You know, he saw this as a form of exoticism, as like the most beautiful thing, you know, taking something that was othered and making it even more othered. He wasn't interested in trying to depict people of like foreign backgrounds as they were. He wanted them to be these imagined figures of beauty and exoticism. And this is kind of like something that we would see as problematic with Baudelaire, but he did this in everything. All of his muses are these other figures. You know, he's really obsessed with this double, right? This idea of something that transforms you, that you have to contend with. So there's another painting by Delacroix, one of his most famous ones, about the French Revolution. Many of us will recognize this image. You know, it's usually associated with Les Miserables. And I wanted to include another quote from Baudelaire in regards to Delacroix. He says, "Decidedly the most original painter of all times, ancient and modern. Everything in his oeuvre is desolation. Smoking, burning cities, raped women, children thrown under the hooves of horses, or stabbed by delirious mothers." He really felt it was important for art to bring out the passionate ugliness of life, you know, the extremeness that he saw in everything that everyone said he was coloring the world with, but he felt that that image, that imagined passion was the real, and that it was important for us to engage with this evil image and to see it in the reality and to confront it head on. So here's another clip from his salon in 1846. Baudelaire he was really, a man of his time, and he was somewhat, like, by modern standards, he would be certainly a racist, an elitist, and a misogynist, even though in his own time, he was very much a progressive. We have to remember that. But this is a very famous painting, the most celebrated painting that came out of the Salon of 1846. And it's by this person named Monsieur Lane. I'm sorry, I'm really bad with these French names. I think it's Lane. And the poem is called Charity. So here's what Baudelaire has to say about this poem, this painting, Charity. He said, "Charity is a charming woman with brats of all countries, white, yellow, and black, and so on, held by the hand or carried at the breast. Certainly, Monsieur Lamline has a feeling for good color. If his picture contains one great fault, is that the little Chinaman is so pretty and his garment so delightful to the eye that he practically monopolizes the specter's attention. The little Mandarin never stops trotting through the memory, and he will cause many people to forget all the rest." So again, this image of the exotic, of the foreign, of the other. And while he loves it, he's afraid also of it. It's this terrifying other. And he believes it's something that could, in many ways, even distract from beauty. So I wanted to include that just so we knew the kind of person that Baudelaire is. Here's another art criticism that he wrote around this time. And this appeared in another French art journal called the Journal La Corsaire Satan in 1846. Now, this is a painting I wanted to get your thoughts on, because you told me that you were familiar with it. Do you want to talk a little bit about this piece?
So two different paths sort of led me to this artwork. One of them is actually Artaud. He acted as Marat in Napoleon. So I was familiar with this scene. I've seen this particular scene from the film, and also this is the cover. This is used as the cover of Death Consciousness by Have a Nice Life, like a shoegaze band from the States.
I love it. This is a really famous and important painting of the time. It's done by this artist Jacques-Louis David. And like you said, it's the death of Marat. And for those of you who don't know Marat is this revolutionary figure in France who helped to bring about the first French Revolution, I believe. And this image is him. Marat suffered a very serious skin condition and spent a lot of his time in his bath in order to alleviate this. And when he was assassinated, he was actually in his bath writing polemics when the guards came and killed him. So this is what Baudelaire has to say about the death of Marat. "The drama has been caught, still living in all its lamentable horror, and by a strange feat that makes of this painting David's true masterpiece, one of the great curiosities of modern art. It has nothing trivial or ignoble about it. There is something in this work that melts the heart and wrings it too. And the chilly air of this chamber on those cold walls around this cold bathtub is also a coffin. There hovers a soul."
Wow.
So this is the kind of romantic art that he was celebrating. It's both real and imaginative and transformative, but it's connected to the modern experience, and it rubs your nose in the ugliness of the real, There's
always an element of violence.
Always violence with Baudelaire. He believed that it was necessary, and something that was such a constant in life. He hated anyone who refused to engage with it, He felt like you were lying, This is a really interesting painting. This is actually of Charles Baudelaire, And it was painted by the realist Gustave Courbet in 1847. Now, Courbet and Baudelaire were very, very good friends. They engaged in the High Art Society of Paris, and would constantly write each other, and they celebrated each other's work ethics, but neither of them really appreciated the other's art in an interesting kind of twist. Courbet was all about realism. He felt it was important for paintings to depict humanity in its truest form, and to show what especially like working people and the average person, what the true experience was, because he saw a lot of traditional art as being removed from society, of being these obtuse Christian images or for the nobility, and not depicting real life. So he felt it was super important to show Baudelaire in his raw essence as this hard worker, as this person dedicated to reading. Baudelaire was such a voracious reader. He claims to have read like every book in the Parisian library, kind of thing. But I wanted to give you this quote from the Musée d'Orsay, talking about this work and the relationship between Courbet and Baudelaire. It says, according to the records of the Musée d'Orsay, since Baudelaire considered the imagination to be the queen of faculties, Baudelaire did not appreciate realism. The d'Orsay records how Baudelaire referred to Courbet as no more than a powerful worker in an August 1855 issue of Le Portefeuille, stating further that the heroic sacrifice that Monsieur Ingres makes for the honor of tradition and the Raphaelesque beauty, Courbet accomplishes in the interests of external, positive, immediate nature. So he does kind of celebrate him, but he felt it was less than. It's like you're showing the same things, but why aren't you taking it to this next level of the imagined? And this was a constant push, and we'll get to it later, but Courbet does respond to this push, at least in regards to Baudelaire. So we'll continue here. So by 1847, Baudelaire publishes his first short work of fiction. It's a semi-autobiographical autobiographical piece. It's called La Fanfarlo, and it's about a kind of a Parisian dandy who falls in love with a mixed race exotic dancer. Does that sound familiar? So this was really about him and his obsessive love with his muse, Jean Duval. And this is a cover, and this is from the first edition, some of the original art that was included. I just thought it was beautiful. And to show you just how obsessive he was, we have many drawings that he would write, and many short writings he wrote about Duval throughout his life. He was constantly doodling her. Even in the notebooks of other lovers, he would doodle her. It was like this constant obsessive streak. He couldn't get over her, even though he refused to marry her because his mother wouldn't accept her, and he was rich and she was mixed and working class. He couldn't let go of this image. He found it to be absolutely intoxicating. So this is an image that Gustave Courbet, Baudelaire's friend, the one we just saw, did. And this is something, it is very much a realist piece. But what's very striking about this is there's one part of this piece that's not realistic and not engaged with realism, and that's the figure of Baudelaire himself. If you guys all look in the far right corner, you'll see a man looking over a book, and that's Baudelaire. If we zoom in, what's super interesting is if you look in the gray and in the shadows here, you'll see the image of Jean Duval haunting Baudelaire while he obsessively reads. And I think that is the most accurate depiction you could ever have of Baudelaire at this time. This sums up his two faculties, this obsessive, voracious reading and this haunted passion for this love of Jean Duval, who he can never get over, could never stop talking about. So I wanted to include a couple passages from Fanfarlo. just so you could get a sense of what he was saying in this book. So he goes, and he depicted himself as this poet in the book called Sam. I can't remember the last name, but he uses a different name and stuff. And he goes, so this is referring to Sam, the antagonist or protagonist of the book. He sadly resumes his path towards a desert that he knows is similar to the one he just crossed, escorted by the pale phantom they call reason, who lights up the aridity of his path with a weak lantern, and who, when the thirst of passion comes back from time to time, quenches it with the poison of ennui. And then this line I really loved. It says, the saddest thing that every love has, or that every love has an unhappy ending, and all the more unhappy in proportion to how divinely it began, with what wings it first took flight. This was something that he felt intrinsically, that all love, all life begins in beauty and ends in evil, ends in absolute destruction. So he ultimately saw his love to Jean Duval as a curse, as like something he had to engage with, that he was obsessively engaging with, but something that would force him to confront evil. And as much as he talks about needing to confront this kind of, these kind of doubles and this evil to balance out the animal and the spiritual in one's life, or the spleen and the ideal, it's painful and he fucking hates it, So I wanted to include, these are a few poems he wrote around this time about Jean Duval, and they appear in his main collected poetry work that comes out a few years later, that we mentioned earlier, The Flowers of Evil, La Fleur de Mal. So this poem is called The Vampire. The Vampire. You who, like the stab of a knife, entered my plaintive heart. You who, strong as a herd of demons, came, ardent and adorned, to make your bed in your domain. Of my humiliated mind, infamous bitch, to whom I'm bound, like the convict to his chain, like the stubborn gambler to the game, like the drunkard to his wine, like the maggots to the corpse. Accursed be you. I begged the swift poniard to gain me my liberty. I asked perfidious poison to give aid to my cowardice. Alas, both poison and the knife contemptuously said to me, you do not deserve to be freed from your accursed slavery. Fool, if from her domination our efforts could deliver you, your kisses would resuscitate the cadaver of your vampire.
Striking imagery.
Right? I thought it was amazing, this idea, like, even if you got rid of Jean, it would come back again, another form. You are cursed by Aphrodite, my friend. She's coming to haunt you. This love, it's a passionate inspiration, but it is a chain that drags you down this path. And he did not like being dragged, which is kind of interesting, because so often when we talk about this idea of the muse and engaging in this kind of magical practice, one of the most important things is to not resist. It's to embrace the muse and to allow yourself to be transformed by her, to embrace her. And you see kind of both with Baudelaire, this embracing and a spurning. And this is a theme that'll come back. And I think it's something that ultimately, destroys him and brings him down and causes him a lot of pain. So here's another poem about Jean Duval. This is The Dancing Serpent. Indolent darling, how I love to see the skin of your body so beautiful shimmer like silk. Upon your heavy head of hair with its acrid scents, adventurous, odorant sea, with blue and brown waves, like a vessel that awakens to the morning wind. My dreamy soul sets sail for a distant sky. Your eyes, where nothing is revealed of bitter or sweet, are two cold jewels where are mingled iron and gold. To see you waking in cadence with fine abandon, one would say a snake which dances on the end of a staff, under the weight of indolence. Your chilled-like head sways gently to and fro like the head of a young elephant, and your body stretches and leans like a slender ship that rolls from side to side and dips its yards in the sea, like a stream swollen by the thaw of rumbling glaciers. When the water of your mouth rises to the edge of your teeth, it seems I drink Bohemian wine, bitter and conquering, a liquid sky that shatters stars in my heart. What do you think of this one?
Very powerful. I love the line, like a stream swollen by the thaw of rumbling glaciers, and the water of your mouth rises to the edge of your teeth. Very like evocative imagery.
Right? It's so powerful. And I want to point out to people some of the magical imagery that's going on as well, right? We all know about the snake, but the snake and the staff, right? That's evocative of both Hermes and Asclepius, and of course just the Magi in general. You know, this unity of the phallus and the feminine that's come together in this divine coiling to create the true magic. And again, this image of the double, of the male and the female, of the spleen and the ideal coming together, you know? And it's like, again, you see this so much, this desire, but this fear, this wanting to possess and to be moved and to be consumed almost by the serpent, but also this terrifying fear and a refusal to engage, you know? So it's very, very evocative of Baudelaire's whole experience with the feminine and with women and with love in general.
It's almost like he's afraid to give himself in to the muse, you know, doesn't want to give up his will.
No, that's very true. He doesn't want to give up his will. He doesn't want to give up certain beliefs and certain things that he holds dear. And this becomes a lot more apparent as his life goes on. So really an intense thing happens in 1848. You have another revolution. This is the fall of the constitutional monarchy and the birth of the Second Republic. So Baudelaire, he kind of engages a bit at this time as a revolutionary. He famously writes for this magazine here, République Française, and he does engage in some revolutionary action because he identified with the poor. He identified with the lower class. He wanted them to be, you know, to be supported and to be taken care of. He saw the ugliness in Paris and he couldn't take it. He wanted to expose that ugliness, you know, and he wanted everyone to be able to achieve this beauty and this ideal. But paradoxically, he also had this incredible love for the high nobility of Paris, and specifically not so much the people, but what they represented and the tradition and the art and that high society. You know, he wanted almost to take the poor that he loved and his art friends and make them the nobility, you know? And at this time too, we see his hatred of his stepfather coming to a form. He actually tried to rile up a mob to go and kill his stepfather, Obique. He wrote impassioned letters about how he was a monarchist and needed to die, and how he was a Catholic extremist. And it's like just some wild, wild stuff.
Wow.
And this is a portrait that was a picture that was taken of him around this time. Isn't that like so radical, but also kind of like just insane. Sorry, I want to just check my notes here because there's a couple things I wanted to say. So yeah, in 1848, he engages in the revolution. He starts to write for this journal. After the revolution, though, he kind of has these deep regrets because, you know, he starts to see the fallout. You know, when you engage in these revolutionary behaviors, you know, it starts in this very impassioned desire to bring equality and justice. But then there is that harsh reality of the violence and the aftermath. And Baudelaire is very honest with himself. And he writes in his letters to his mother that he wasn't a revolutionary. His true politics were he had a taste for vengeance and a natural passion for destruction. And he describes himself as being caught up in the Bacchic revelry, as being immersed in the mob mentality. And this is something on one hand he loved, but terrified him. And you see, after he has this kind of complete separation with politics. In fact, he says that politics are almost like the greatest of evils because they are absolute falsehood and only exist as propaganda. And he believed that any art, any poetry that contained politics automatically made it unworthy and made it something to be spurned and denigrated. And at this time, he starts returning back to his Catholicism, but not out of a belief of Catholicism in God, but a love of the pageantry, a love of the nobility, a love of Parisian high society. He still engages with the same people. He still has a respect for the poor and stuff, but he no longer has this desire to achieve liberty, equality that we see at the heart of the French Revolution. He's really kind of disillusioned by this experience of revolution and seeing his beloved Paris be destroyed and having engaged in that destruction. And he admits so, and it was almost entirely a lapse of judgment. So at this point is it's considered to be one of the lowest points in Baudelaire's life. He, in the 1850s, kind of removes himself from a lot of the art world. And he really kind of dedicates himself to this literary task of translating and engaging with Edgar Allan Poe in this near obsessive way, to the point where he translates 12 volumes of Poe's literature, almost half of everything he ever released. And I wanted to include this. This is an edition of The Raven that was published with some ink drawings that I just thought were incredible. And it shows kind of the contrast between the French and the English. Baudelaire really, like I said, he believed it was his mission and his duty on earth to expose the world to good art. And he felt that Poe was the greatest artist the world had ever seen. And he felt that Poe was meant to be spoken in the French. He even describes how America was anti-Poe in that it couldn't understand Poe, and that American excess and ridiculousness is what destroyed Poe. And he felt that Poe's original language was even French. He talks about this. He believed like they were somehow psychically linked, And like I said earlier, Poe had died in 1849. So by 1850, when he's seriously engaged in this process of translation, it's as a result of finding out that his hero had died and he never got to correspond with him. He never got to meet him. He always believed that they would come together. But now he saw this as the loss of his double, where he was the impassioned ideal and Poe was the dark spleen, And what's really interesting, when I was looking through a lot of the literature and reading about Baudelaire and Poe, Poe is so much more celebrated in France. And a lot of poetry scholars and linguists argue that much of it has to do with Baudelaire and his extraordinarily faithful rendition of Poe into the French. And there's just this quality of Poe's writing that lends itself to the French language. So even a lot of modern scholars, though they don't have the kind of spiritual lens that Baudelaire was bringing, they come to similar conclusions almost, that Poe's imagery is meant to be in the French. It's better represented by French language in a kind of a wild way. But regardless of what we think or what the scholars think, Poe had far more of an impact in the French world than he ever did in the English. And he was far more celebrated in France than he ever has been in America. It wasn't until much later in modern times that Poe has achieved this status as the literary giant and as the godfather of horror. And a lot of that has to do with pop culture, you know, like we all grew up with The Simpsons and we kind of laugh at that, but that was kind of a rebirth of Poe in the modern consciousness. And it really brought him to this position that he now holds as like the king of Gothic literature. He was not so originally, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to, this is a bit of a longer passage, but it was so impassioned, and it comes from an autobiography, or sorry, a biography that Baudelaire wrote about Poe. So it says, upon the heart of this literature, where the air is rarefied, the mind can feel that vague anguish, that fear prompt to tears, that sickness of the heart which dwells in places vast and strange. But the admiration is stronger, and then art is so great. All the accessories are there, thoroughly appropriate to the characters. The silent solitude of nature, the bustling agitation of the city are all described there, nervously and fantastically, like our Eugene Delacroix, who had elevated his art to the height of grand poetry. Edgar Poe loves to move his figures upon a ground of green or violet, where the phosphorescence of putrefaction and the odor of the hurricane reveal themselves. Nature inanimate, so styled, participates of the nature of living beings, and like it trembles with a shiver, supernatural and galvanic. Space is fathomed by opium, for opium gives a magic tinge to all the hues and causes every nose to vibrate with the most sonorous magnificence. Sometimes glorious visions, full of light and color, suddenly unroll themselves in its landscape. And on the furthest horizon line, we see oriental cities and palaces, mist-covered in the distance, which the sun floods with golden showers. The characters of Poe, or rather the character of Poe, the man with sharpened faculties, the man with nerves relaxed, the man who's ardent and patient, who bids a defiance to difficulties, whose glance is steadfastly fixed with the rigidness of a sword upon objects that increase the more he gazes. This man is Poe himself, and his woman, all luminous and sickly, dying of a thousand unknown ills, and speaking with a voice resembling music, are still himself, or at least by their strange aspirations, by their knowledge, by their incurable melancholy, they participate strongly in the nature of their creator. As to his ideal woman, his Titanide, she reveals herself under different names, scattering in his, alas, too scanty poems, portraits, or rather modes of fleeing beauty, which the temperament of the author begins together and confounds in a unity, vague but sensible, and where more delicately perhaps than elsewhere glows that insatiable passion for the beautiful, which forms his greatest claim, that is to say, the essence of all his claims, to the affection and the respect of poets. What do you think of that?
The way that he writes really reminds me of Artaud in a way. In this passage, I kind of lost my train of thought there, but just it's a very like powerful passage, though.
Right? It's so like you really see his passion for Poe and just how much he celebrated him and loved him. And I really love this he gets into his idea again of the homo dulux, where he sees Poe's muse, right? Poe wrote famously of two important muses, Ligeia and Lenore. And he saw these as Poe's double, as his muse, but as the spiritual self, the feminine self that needed to be united, that needed to be confronted, the other that brought out the beauty of the self, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And this talk, I remember what I was thinking now, is this talk about this praise of opium. That's what really reminded me of Artaud, because he had this like dual nature with opium, where he would kind of just the withdrawal would destroy him, but he felt that like when he was using, it would create this like dream world where he could tap into the muse almost.
Yeah, this is a constant theme with a lot of these people who are engaged, especially with laudanum, where laudanum, it's so addictive and it's so destructive, but it creates these dreamscapes that are so provocative, people keep coming back, and even there's a couple times where he breaks free of the addiction and he goes back not out of addiction, but out of desire for the dream, and it's sad to see, because we ultimately know what happens to Baudelaire. But let's continue. I wanted to include, so after he starts engaging in this translation and in serious engagement of Poe, this is when he decides that it's his duty now to become the poet. He's been the art critic. He still has this goal of bringing Poe to the world, especially the French world. But he also now sees himself as he must become the poet. He quotes Poe, and he cites this passage about Poe and in Poe's talk of poetry as the reason. It says, this is what Poe has to say about poets. He said, "I would define in brief the poetry of words as the rhythmical creation of beauty. Its sole arbiter is taste. With the intellect or the conscience, it has only collateral relations." So this image of the beauty is so important to Baudelaire, because he saw beauty as that balancing force between the ugly and, between the animal and the spiritual, or the spleen and the ideal. It was that force that could navigate one through the darkest channels and appreciate that seductive, raw eroticism, but also the sublime high art of sun and flowers. So this is what Baudelaire had to say about poets. "There are but three things worthy of respect: the priest, the warrior, and the poet. To know, to kill, and to create." And he saw himself as a creator. And he saw that by embracing this feminine side of himself, it was to draw down this muse, this beauty, and to create, to become this female vessel. It's kind of interesting. He's very much a very masculine man. He's not like, there's nothing about gender or sex involved in this. This is a impassioned plea of the self becoming whole and balancing these two faculties. He really saw the feminine and the masculine as two sides of the same coin, as this human experience, this human totality. So at this time is when he starts assembling and writing a lot of his poetry. So like we saw, he had written many poems about his muse. He wrote poems about his experiences in Mauritius. He also starts to write a lot of poems about the revolution and what happened in the destruction of his beloved Paris. And he starts to collect them and publish them in this particular paper, which was called Revue des Mondes. And one of his first poems that he publishes is called Les Limbes, or The Limbos. I didn't select this one to read, but it was one of the very first ones published. I couldn't find a better image, unfortunately. And here we have the first edition of Fleur de Mal. So by about 1855, 1856, he throws himself into this work entirely. He actually moves into his publisher's house, and he starts dictating how everything should go in this work. He's beyond obsessive, to the point of absurdity. So this is the first print copy that was given to Baudelaire by his publisher. And these are his notes. Every page is like this. Every single page. He was obsessive. He was like, no, I want this line here. I want this image here. I want this little thing here. There are special spelling mistakes. There are certain grammatical errors. There are ways of page breaks in lines. Everything was meticulously thought over. And this took him years to do. And his publisher almost went nuts trying to do this for him. And then on the right here is one of the illustrations that was included with the original publication.
Wow.
So when this book comes out, it immediately causes this massive outcry. And it is seen as this incredibly debauched kind of poetry. And people freak out, even though there's only about 1,000 copies of this book that gets printed. And a lot of that has to do with the scene of Paris at the time. So famously, Flaubert writes his, Gustave Flaubert writes his magnum opus, Madame Bovary, and it also goes to trial for indecency. But Bovary, he manages to avoid serious censorship. And this actually really upsets the Parisian authorities and turns them even more staunchly against Baudelaire. So the court banned 6 of Baudelaire's erotic poems, 2 of them on lesbian themes, and the other 4 heterosexual sex, but mildly sadomasochistic. And what's wild about this is the ban doesn't even get released until 1949. Think about that. Almost 100 years later, right? This is published in 1857, not till 1949. So he says, like Flaubert, Baudelaire was rebuked by the court for his realism. This is kind of funny, I thought. The judge held that some of his poems necessarily led to the excitement of the senses by a crude realism offensive to public decency. The poet had already distanced himself from Courbet's visual realism, and the court was using the term in a very general sense. But Baudelaire's fascination with the detritus of urban life and did chime with the realist concerns, so like realism, he was interested in showing the raw visceralness of the poor and of average life, so they tried to lump him in with the realists, and this really pissed off Baudelaire. No, my art is imaginative. It's not reality, and it's meant to confront you and challenge you. And they accused him of celebrating debauchery, and Baudelaire was like, it's not a celebration of debauchery. He wanted to kind of distance himself from the romantics. He loved Byron, but he saw, like, within Byron especially, this too much of the celebration of the erotic and of the evil, and this refusal to engage with the mirror of that image and see the true ugliness there. He admired the fact that these romantics were going to these places and trying to show their beauty, but he's like, if you engage in this kind of debauchery, there is a destruction, there is an evil, there is an ugliness that one has to confront and overcome. And for him, he felt that this was important to all of life, right? Confronting evil, confronting the ideal, and coming to balance. So here's what Baudelaire wrote to his mother in one of his letters about his poems being heavily edited, redacted, and 6 of them being outright removed. He says, that I have always considered that literature and the arts pursue an aim independent of morality. Beauty of conception and style is enough for me. But this book, whose title, Fleur de Mal, says everything, is clad, as you will see, in cold and sinister beauty. It was created with rage and patience. Besides the proof of its positive worth and all the ill that they speak of it, the book enrages people. Moreover, since I was terrified myself of the horror that I should inspire, I cut out a third from the proofs. They deny me everything, the spirit of invention, even the knowledge of the French language. I don't care a rap about all these imbeciles, and I know that this book, with its virtues and its faults, will make its way into the memory of the lettered public, besides the poems of Victor Hugo, Théophile Gautier, and even Byron.
And he's sort of right in a way.
He's right. It did become celebrated, right? And unfortunately, like most of these kind of troubled artists, it wasn't until after his death. And in many ways, Baudelaire and how he wrote about art and art criticism, he kind of invents the trope of the tortured artist. He believed that doom was necessary for art, and a true artist had to have a horrific life. And he celebrated the life of Poe and its bleakness almost as much as he celebrated Poe, you know, and he celebrated the bleakness and ugliness of his own life and Paris, you know. So he saw this as intrinsic to art and to the expression of reality, you know. And again, this using the imagination to confront the self and to balance the spleen and the ideal. So this is one of the poems that got cut from the original. It's called A Carcass. Sometimes it's translated as Carrion. This was widely considered to be the most offensive of his poems. So I'll read this one for you. So please, bear in mind, we're going to get dark. A Carcass. My love, do you recall the object which we saw, that fair sweet summer morn, at a turn in the path of a foul carcass, on a gravel-strewn bed, its legs raised in the air like a lustful woman, burning and dripping with poisons, displayed in a shameless, nonchalant way, its belly swollen with gases. The sun shone down upon that putrescence, as if to roast it to a turn, and to give back 100-fold to great nature the elements she had combined. And the sky was watching that superb cadaver blossom like a flower. So frightful was the stench that you believed you'd faint away upon the grass. The blowflies were buzzing round that putrid belly, from which came forth black battalions of maggots, which oozed out like a heavy liquid all along those living tatters. All this was descending and rising like a wave, or poured out with a crackling sound. One would have said the body, swollen with a vague breath, lived by multiplication, and this world gave forth singular music, like running water or the wind, or the grain that winnowers with a rhythmic motion shake in the air winnowing baskets. The forms disappeared and were no more than a dream, a sketch that slowly falls upon the forgotten canvas, that the artist completes from memory alone. Crouched behind the boulders, an anxious dog watched us with an angry eye, waiting for the moment to take back from the carcass the morsel he had left. And yet you will be like this corruption, like this horrible infection. Star of my eyes, sunlight of my being, you, my angel in my passion. Yes, thus you will be queen of the graces after the last sacraments, when you go beneath grass luxuriant flowers to molder among the bones of the dead. Then, O my beauty, say to the worms who will devour you with kisses that I have kept the form and the divine essence of my decomposed love.
You know what this reminds me of is there was an art movement in Japan. I can't remember the time period, called Kusozuru, which was the beautiful depiction of putrefaction. And they would paint these like very intense watercolors of bodies in various states of decay to show the beauty of the transition from life into death. And
Right.
This reminds me of that.
I can so see that, you know. This is so quintessentially Baudelaire, gazing into the destruction, gazing into the abyss, confronting death head on and transforming it into beauty, you know, so that you can cope, so that you can reaffirm life, so that you can create that double, that mirror, and bring yourself into balance along that spectrum of the spleen and the ideal, or the animal and the spirit, you know. And I want to point out to those with ears to hear some of the very evocative magical language. So those of you who have read the Odyssey will immediately notice the winnowing baskets and the winnowers. This is the winnowing fan of Odysseus, his cross that he bears into the land on the guidance of, after he goes to the underworld. And, you know, so this is like, it's trying to bring up these images And there's so much, the graces, right? Within the Hellenism, you have the 7 graces, who are 7 images of the goddess that give charity, that give blessings. And what's wild here is he's seeing the grace coming forth from this death, right? He sees how the dog survives off the carrion. He sees this, there's so much beauty coming out of this decomposition. And he's recognizing too, his own love is in this state of decomposition. And it's in this, he always saw love as like a constant angle going downwards. It begins in this absolute passion and was doomed to go into death and destruction. And you may be able to revitalize it at points, but it was ultimately doomed to die. And the only way to get through this was to confront that death full on and to embrace it, to accept love's end and love's ultimate destruction and your own destruction, right?
In alchemy, the first stage of alchemy is nigredo, which is the putrefaction. Like the form, the matter has to be broken down before it can become something new.
Right. And of course, we're always confronted with the magic of Dionysus, which is the ability to reassemble. Dionysus is that cosmic eros figure that exists within the world that can reassemble and take us back up to the eros of the divine, that phanes, the one that comes from the Orphic egg, which is that pure hermaphrodite, that pure double, this thing that Baudelaire is striving for, that ultimate balanced person, So very powerful, very alchemical. And you can see how he recognized it was through the facing of death and through going through that destruction that you are able to use beauty to confront evil and balance it, confront death, confront the putrefaction. So this is a poem that begins at the start of Les Fleurs de Mal, and it's called To the Reader. And I wanted to read it because it really kind of sets up his whole kind of worldview and how he wanted you to experience the poems, and it kind of really shows this doubling. So, to the reader, folly, error, sin, avarice occupy our minds and labor our bodies, and we feed our pleasant remorse as beggars nourish their vermin. Our sins are obstinate, our repentance is faint. We exact a high price for our confessions, and we gaily return to the miry path, believing that base tears wash away all our stains. On the pillow of evil Satan, Trismegistus incessantly lulls our enchanted minds, and the noble metal of our will is wholly vaporized by the wise alchemist. The devil holds the strings which move us. In repugnant things we discover charms. Every day we descend a step further toward hell, without horror, through gloom that stinks, like a penniless rake, who with kisses and bites tortures the breast of an old prostitute. We steal as we pass by a clandestine pleasure, that we squeeze very hard like a dried up orange, serried, swarming like a million maggots. A legion of demons carouses in our brains, and when we breathe, death, that unseen river, descends into our lungs with muffled wails. If rape, poison, daggers, arson have not yet embroidered with their pleasing designs the banal canvas of our pitiable lives, it is because our souls have not enough boldness. But among the jackals, the panthers, the bitch hounds, the apes, the scorpions, the vultures, the serpents, the yelping, howling, growling, crawling monsters, in the filthy menagerie of our vices, there is one more ugly, more wicked, more filthy. Although he makes neither great gestures nor great cries, he would willingly make of the earth a shambles, and in a yearn swallow the world. He is ennui, his eye watery as though with tears. He dreams of scaffolds as he smokes his hookah pipe. You know him, reader, that refined monster. Hippocratish reader, my fellow, my brother. What do you think?
It reminds me a lot of the intro to Songs of Maldor by Isidore Ducasse, which doesn't surprise me because Ducasse and Lautremont loved Baudelaire. Just the way that he sets up, the way he sets it up is very reminiscent of that.
I want people to notice there's two magical images that are being, well, multiple magical images, but there are two magical images you may not immediately see if you don't have knowledge of this, and that is the Trismegistus. That's the invocation of the thrice great Hermes, right? The Hermes that was the philosophical magician who taught the magic to the Egyptians, who was the inventor of language within the Hermetic tradition, And it's also evocative of that Hermes Thos that is the god of communication, and he's conflating them with that Satan. But there is another image of the Satan here that we need to confront, and that is the Satan that is Saturn, the ennui. And it's very clear to me that he's invoking this all-father, dark Saturnian image because of the loss of the eye. He only has one eye, his eye watery as though with tears. He dreams of scaffolds as he smokes his hookah pipe. Saturn, Kronos, is the one who rips out his eye in his form of Odin in order to know the mystery. He has to go. He's the one who's been brought low, who's been castrated, who's been made to suffer for his crimes of tyranny and has paid the ultimate price. But through this paying of that price, he has gained the knowledge of death and rebirth. He's gone through that process. He can reflect upon his mistakes and see them for what they are. And this is the power of Saturn. He is that monster who devours his children, but he is the one who's gone through it and been reborn, who's been given that chance to reflect, who's been given that ability to teach us and also to hold us to account. I always love to depict Saturn as that man with the knife who stands behind us, constantly telling us to walk forward into the unknown. And if you don't move forward and confront that change, you die. You are brought low and you are destroyed. It's a very powerful poem. I also want to point out, too, the jackals, the panthers, the bitch hounds. These are people. These are evocative for those who understand the Greek. These, when they talk of dogs and they talk of jackals, they're referring to a type of powerful person who's engaged in the magic. And I also want to point out, he recognizes that the magic, the poisons, come from death too. They come from this destruction. It's only in destruction that we gain the magic to heal and to confront. Medicine comes from poison. Drugs are a poison, even as they expand the mind. This is something that Baudelaire would be all too intimate with. He used hashish, he used laudanum, right? He was very well acquainted with Saturn Kronos. So let's continue here. This is one of his most famous poems and probably the most celebrated poem from the collection. And this is him talking about, it's called Beauty here, but it's usually translated as a hymn to beauty. I just really like this particular version. And he's conflating the beautiful with the muse, with the goddess. Okay? I am fair, O mortals, like a dream carved in stone. And my breast, where each one in turn has bruised himself, is made to inspire in the poet a love, as eternal and silent as matter, on a throne in the sky, a mysterious sphinx. I join a heart of snow to the whiteness of swans. I hate movement, for it displaces lines. And never do I weep, and never do I laugh. Poets before my grandiose poses, which I seem to assume from the proudest statues, will consume their lives in austere study, for I have to enchant those submissive lovers, pure mirrors that make all things more beautiful. My eyes, my large wide eyes of eternal brightness. He's identifying the goddess as this mirror, as this beauty, as this one that brings you to the balance. But it's also this confrontation, the one that forces the death and rebirth through the mysterious sphinx, the one who sits upon the throne. And as magicians, we understand that you need to sit upon the throne in order to conduct magic. You need to take that position of authority, and from that power base, command the universe. And this is a form of hubris, but it is something that all magicians engage with. And it is something that the goddess calls you to. You know, it's this grand paradox, you know? And it's such a powerful image, you know? She is this unmoving, unchanging thing that exists outside of time, that exists beyond everything, that can bring us the balance. And we are constantly in this state of flux, and we constantly strive to perceive her so we can make sense of our moment, of our modern experience, to bring this balance into our life, right? Because everything we experience is flux, but she is that unchanging other, that blackness of space that exists outside of time, that's not subjected to the magic of Saturn Chronos. Wild, eh?
Very.
So around after he publishes this in 1857, 1858, life starts to take a very dark turn for Baudelaire. He becomes heavily addicted to laudanum. His books don't sell. He expected his books to sell well, but because the first edition is destroyed and he has to reprint it in a censored form, and the censored form is not selling as well. And then his muse, the love of his life, Jean Duval, she has a paralytic stroke at this time, probably caused by syphilis, which they both had, and she becomes bedridden. He continues to support her, and he continues to love her, but he is so distraught by this. And he ultimately sees reflected in her his ultimate fate. And he keeps talking about how he's going to wind up like Poe. His ultimate fate is to be Poe. And he's rebelling against this, but also embracing it. He engages in a lot of self-destructive behavior at this time. His laudanum addiction goes up to 1,000. He starts to become increasingly erratic. But also at this time, he's again starts engaging in more art criticism in prose, because that's what brought him money. And we get some of his most famous works around this time. I wanted to include this. This is actually something that comes later. This is he winds up in desperation moving with his publisher to Belgium in 1866. And he winds up releasing all of the poetry that was excluded, that was removed. And he publishes it in a book called like The Scraps, or Les Epavies, I think. Please, French people, excuse me, I'm butchering your most beautiful language. I'm just going to call it The Scraps. I have nothing but love for French, but I am, a garble mouth. So this is one of the poems that was included in the leftovers, or the scraps. And this is one of the poems that was considered too lesbian and too erotic to be included. And I love this poem because it invokes Sappho in the Isle of Lesbos, and it invokes lesbianism, which was a radical thing to do at this time. So this is called Lesbos. Mother of Roman games and Greek delights, Lesbos, where kisses languorous or glad, as hot as suns or watermelon fresh, make festivals of days and glorious nights. Mother of Roman games and Greek delights, Lesbos, where love is like the wild cascades that throw themselves into the deepest gulfs, and twist and run with gurglings and with sobs, stormy and secret, swarming underground, Lesbos, where love is like the wild cascades, Lesbos, where Phrynes seek each other out, where no sigh ever went without response, lovely as Paphos in the sight of stars, where Venus envies Sappho with good cause. Lesbos, where Phrynes seek each other out. Lesbos, land of warm and languid nights that draw in mirrors sterile fantasies. So girls with hollow eyes make love alone, fondling their avid bodies, mellow fruit. Lesbos, land of the warm and languid night. Let some dry Plato frown with narrow eyes, queen of sweet empire, pleasant, noble land. You're pardoned by the excess of your kisses and by your endless subtleties in love. Let some dry Plato frown with narrowed eyes. You're pardoned by eternal martyrdom. Live constantly in those with hungering hearts, who glimpse that radiant smile beyond our grasp, that beckons from the brink of other skies. You're pardoned by eternal martyrdom. What God would dare to act as Lesbos' judge, and to condemn your pale and wasted brow, without the weighing in those golden scales of floods of tears your brooks have swept to sea? What God would dare to act as Lesbos' judge? What do we care for laws or right, wrong? Maidens of highest heart, pride of the land, as worthy as another is your creed, and your love will laugh at heaven and at hell. What do we care for laws of right and wrong, since I am Lesbos' choice from all on earth to sing the secret of her flowering maids, and I from childhood worshipped in the cult of frenzied laughter, mixed with somber tears, since I am Lesbos' choice from all on earth. I spend my time on watch from Lucas Peak, a sentinel with sure and piecing eye, who searches night and day for sail or hull. The distant forms that tremble in the blue, I spend my time on watch from Lucas Peak to find out if the sea is ever kind, and to the land where sobbing lives in stones will carry home to Lesbos, who forgives, the worshipped corpse of Sappho, who made trial to find out if the sea is ever kind. Of Sappho, male in poetry and love, fairer than Venus, though her face be pale. The azure eye is conquered by the black, shadowed by circles, drawn by all the grief. Of Sappho, male in poetry and love, fairer than Venus, rising on the world, who spreads out treasures of serenity and all the radiance of her blonde youth, on Father Ocean, dazzled by his child, fairer than Venus, rising on the world. Of Sappho, who that day blasphemed and died, when she against the right the cult devised, let her sweet body be the rutting ground, for a brute whose pride condemned the heresy of one who on that day blasphemed and died. And since that time, Lesbos has lived with tears, neglecting honors that the world holds forth. She stupefies herself each night with cries that beat her barren shores against the skies. And since that time, Lesbos has lived with tears. So what do you think of that one?
Powerful stuff.
Right? It's important that when we look at this one, we see Baudelaire as a man of his time and his place. And we have to recognize how taboo lesbianism is, and how the act of poetry, and especially erotic poetry, was a male practice within French society. So he really identified himself with Sappho. And for those who don't know, Sappho is widely considered to be one of the greatest of the Greek poets. The most famous of the female poets, one of the only ones who has survived to us in a large amount. And she was at the Isle of Lesbos, where she had her poetical school and famously taught women. And she wrote poems of love for other women, very explicitly homosexual poems. And it's important here, too, that we recognize this love of the creative aspect of the woman and this identification with that creative aspect, right? Baudelaire is a poet, and for him, poetry was feminine, and it was a creative act. And he had to embrace the feminine in all of its glory in order to bring that out. And he even talks sometimes about how he saw his poems as being this almost lesbian eroticism, because he is coming from this poetic position, of the feminine. And it's such an intense poem where Venus envies Sappho with good cause. I love that line so much because Sappho is such a muse of all muses, this figure of beauty who transcends herself. And Baudelaire really wanted this to happen for him in the way that he saw it happening for Poe. He felt that one's image could transcend time and place and become immortalized through their art. And he could even challenge the gods themselves. And he saw this in Sappho. I also want to point out the rebellion that he's putting forth here against the sterile righteousness that he sees embodied in the figure of Plato. He saw Plato as this person who was all about morality, who spurned homosexuality in his writings. And he challenges that, and he doesn't get political or engage too deeply with Plato, but he definitely was against him in this way, in his hatred of homosexuality. Because for Baudelaire, right, the male and the female exist in everyone. And he doesn't see this as a negative. He sees this as a celebration of love. And he saw Sappho as engaging with that male aspect of herself, as being one in pure balance. And this was seen through her love of women, So it's almost in his mind a higher love. Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So I wanted to include that one just because it's for the time, it was such a radical thing. And I know a lot of feminist scholars are critical of this because, he's such a male person and he is a misogynist, and he is coming at least by our modern conceptions, and he is coming at this from a very masculine point of view. But you're seeing someone who is at least embracing and trying to confront the feminine in himself and the feminine in others. And he's, rather than spurning homosexuality, he's celebrating it as a beautiful love of the self and of the other, and of this doubling, of this becoming the whole hermaphrodite, the divine being, that cosmogonic eros or phonies,
Yeah. I love that line, enter the land where sobbing lives in stones. Just a very powerful line. It stood out to me.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, there's so much here that we could get into, but I highly recommend you all read Le Fleur de Mal. The latest versions of this book contain all of the poems, as well as many poems that were left out during Baudelaire's lifetime. So, and some of them you can find, I have a critical edition, which has the edited versions and the unedited versions as well, which is really worth getting into. There's even a really amazing website called Le Fleur de Mal. If you just search that on Google, it's like one of the first ones to come up. And they contain all of the poems from all of the editions with multiple translations. It's amazing.
Oh.
So I originally, this got a little bit out of order. That was in 1866. This is supposed to be around the same time, but he first publishes these essays in 1863 before he takes off to Belgium as a result of not having money and wanting to publish his works a second time, at least those that had been, deemed inappropriate for French society. But many of us will be famous with these writings and these essays, because Baudelaire, the art critic, is such a powerful figure. He coined the term modernity. He defined his era as a critic, and his language and the way he saw his era impacted everyone that came after. And this language has been adopted into English and has become synonymous with modernism, So he collected all of these works that he wrote about modern life and all of his essays about art criticism from 1963 to 1966 in this book, The Painter of Modern Life. And I wanted to include this passage he wrote describing what he means by modernity. By modernity, I mean the ephemeral, the fugitive, the contingent, the half of art whose other half is the eternal and immutable. This transitory fugitive element, whose metamorphoses are so rapid, must on no account be despised or dispensed with. By neglecting it, you cannot fail to tumble into the abyss, an abstract and indeterminate beauty like that of the time the first woman before the fall of man. So it's important here, he's identifying that cosmogonic eros as distinctly feminine, right? The first female, that Eve, before the fall, that purity. And he's talking about how you can destroy your purity if you do not embrace the flux and the change, if you do not embrace the modern moment and confront the present. You know, this was so important to Baudelaire because he saw so much of the people of his time either obsessively reaching to the future or fearfully scraping for the past, you know? And he wanted to be of the now, you know? He was also still very much in love with the past. He kind of had this hatred of the future. So it's kind of interesting. He writes all of this stuff about modernity and he embraces it to a certain extent, but he also he's unable to live up to his own ideals in many ways, I think, paradoxically, you know? Like I think many of us, you know?
Yeah.
Right? And one of the last things that he writes is he translates Confessions of an English opium eater. And this book is by Thomas de Quincey. And it was originally published by de Quincey in 1823. And it caused a massive drug epidemic. It led to laudanum becoming like this super celebrated drug across Europe. And Baudelaire saw this as one of the most important things for creating high art. And he loved his laudanum. He saw his laudanum, as we talked about, inducing that dream, allowing him to perceive that beauty that could bring balance to himself. And this was the last large work that he would engage with. And unfortunately, what ends up happening with Baudelaire is by 1866, he has a heart attack. And probably due to laudanum, could also be due to syphilis. It's hard to say. But he's made an invalid, and he spends the next year being transported across various hospitals in Belgium until he passes away. This was the final thing he ever did was Histories Grotesque and Serious by Edgar Allan Poe that he translated. Wow. And that was the last work that he finished before he died. And here is his cenotaph. He was buried in his beloved Paris, and they have him in this pensive kind of look, sitting in a fountain. I thought that was just very, very apt for Baudelaire. He has a poem called The Fountain. I didn't include it, but it's a very powerful poem I think everyone should read.
Seems kind of fitting that the last thing he did is about Poe.
Right? He had such a love affair with Poe, and he identified so much with Poe, and he kind of dies the same way Poe dies, by addiction. And you know, that debauchery that he felt was so necessary to his artistic creation, you know, and this confrontation with evil eventually caught up to him, you know?
Yeah.
So what did you think of Baudelaire's history before we get into reading a few of his poems?
Very interesting, Letty. Now that I've learned more about him, I see more obviously the influence in a lot of other artists who cite him as an influence. Like I see it now. I didn't really see the influence before because I didn't know much about him. But yeah, I can see his influence in Ducasse and Artaud and a bunch of other writers as well.
Right. He leaves such a lasting mark on literature in general, especially French literature, but on literature in general, right? He's this bridge figure between the romantic and the modern. You know, he sees the excesses of romanticism and he confronts it head on. He keeps that imaginative idealism and that love of beauty, but he brings it into the body, into this idea of the homo dulex, right? This duality of self and this obsession with the present and confronting the now, you know? Something I really appreciate about him. I do find he really reminds me also a lot like Kawine, the first figure we talked about, someone whose poverty eventually caught up to him and excess caught up to him. Also, his politics and his, as much as he was a person of his time, he had this obsessiveness with this idealization of high society and of nobility that he was unwilling to let go of. He tells everyone to embrace change and to embrace the modern, and he does in many ways, but in other ways he can't, you know? And he talks about this necessity for balance, but he was unable to achieve that balance in his own life, that dote and that antidote. And this is something we see with a lot of magicians, you know, when you engage in the entheogens, when you engage in those magical drugs, they can bring the dream, but there are poisons and they can destroy you. They can cause psychosis or they can cause the destruction of the body, you know, and we're all too familiar with that, aren't we, Grant?
Yes, we are.
Wow. So this is a poem I wanted to read. This is a shout out to my good friend Gandhi. This was the poem that kind of inspired me to go into this. I had mentioned Ammon, but it was really Gandhi sharing a bunch of the screenshots of the Fleur de Mal, and particularly this poem that I was like, okay, I cannot not do Baudelaire. He's on the list. So this is for you, Gandhi. Conversation. You are a lovely autumn sky, clear and rosy. But sadness rises in me like the sea, and as it ebbs, leaves on my sullen lips the burning memory of its bitter slime. In vain does your hand slip over my swooning breast. What it seeks, darling, is a place plundered by the claws and the ferocious teeth of woman. Seek my heart no longer. The beasts have eaten it. My heart is a palace polluted by the mob. They get drunk there, kill, tear each other's hair. A perfume flutes about your naked breast. O beauty, ruthless scourge of souls, you desire it. With the fire of your eyes, brilliant as festivals, bum these tatters which the beasts spared. Again, we have this image of beauty as this goddess and this confrontation of the self as the woman, right? The poet is the female, and he's clawing at his breasts. Even as he desires the female, he recognizes the female in himself, you know? And he sees his heart as this palace polluted by the mob. To me, that line was deeply evocative of his earlier comments he made to his mother about, I only joined in the revolution for bloodlust, you know? And right? And I always love about Baudelaire, there's this harsh criticism, you know? There's this, even as he celebrates the ugliness, he's critical of it, and especially of himself. So this is Spleen. This is a longer piece, but I felt it was important that we go over it because the spleen and this idea of the spleen, like this is an earlier kind of French concept, but within Baudelaire, it becomes this central idea, this juxtaposition against the ideal, this thing you need to balance yourself with. It's that ultimate depravity, the ultimate depression, the ultimate darkness as embodied in the figure of Poe. So here's Spleen. February, peeved at Paris, pours, a gloomy torrent on the pale Lyces. Of the graveyard next door, and a mortal chill, on tenants of the foggy suburbs too. The tiles afford no comfort to my cat, that cannot keep its mangy body still. The soul of some old poet haunts the drains, and howls as if a ghost could hate the cold. A church bell grieves, a log in the fireplace smokes, and hums falsetto to the clock's catarrh, while in a filthy, reeking deck of cards, inherited from a dropsical old maid, the daper knave of hearts and the queen of spades grimly disinter their love affairs. Souvenirs? More than if I had lived 1,000 years. No chest of drawers crammed with documents, love letters, wedding invitations, wills, a lock of someone's hair rolled up in deed, hides so many secrets as my brain. This branching catacombs, this pyramid, contains more corpses than the potter's field. I am a graveyard that the moon abhors, where long worms like regrets come out to feed most ravenously on my dearest dead. I am an old boudoir, where a rack of gowns, perfumed by withered roses, rots to dust, where only faint pastels and pale bouchers inhale the scent of long unstoppered flasks. Nothing is slower than the limping days, when under the heavy weather of the years, boredom, the fruit of glum indifference, gains the dimension of eternity. Hereafter, mortal clay, you are no more than a rock encircled by a nameless dread, an ancient sphinx omitted from the map, forgotten by the world, and whose fierce moods sing only to the rays of setting suns. I am like the king of a rainy country, rich but helpless, decrepit though still a young man, who scorns his feigning tutors, wastes his time on dogs and other animals, and has no fun. Nothing distracts him, neither hawk nor hound nor subjects, starving at the palace gates. His favorite fool's obscenities fall flat. The royal invalid is not amused, and ladies in waiting for a princely prod no longer dress indecently enough to win a smile from this young skeleton. The bed of state becomes a stately tomb. The alchemist who brews his gold has failed to purge the impure substance from his soul, and bathes of blood. Rome's legacy recalled by certain barons in their failing days are useless to revive the sickly flesh, through which no blood but brackish lethe seeps. When the skies are low and heavy as a lid, over the mind tormented by disgust, and hidden in the gloom, the sun pours down on us a daylight dingier than the dark. When earth becomes a trickling dungeon, where trust, like a bat, keeps lunging through the air, beating tentative wings along the walls and bumping its head against the rotten beams. When rain falls straight from the unrelenting clouds, forging the bards of some enormous jail, and silent hordes of obscene spiders spin their webs across the basements of our brains. Then all at once, the raging bells break loose, hurling to heaven their awful caterwaul, like homeless ghosts with no one left to haunt, whimpering their endless grievances. A giant heareth without dirge or drums, parade at half step in my soul, where hope defeated weeps and the oppressor dread plants his black flag on my assenting skull.
It's pretty dark themes.
This is kind of Baudelaire at his most metaphysically dark. And what I really liked about this poem is that it's autobiographical. Like, just going through this poem, we've pretty much heard his entire relationship with Jean Duval, his self-destructiveness, his love of Poe, his obsession with trying to confront the evil, and this desire to be reborn, and his pursuit of becoming the alchemist, the one who can turn himself back into that cosmogonic figure, this gold, right? The metaphysical gold of the sun, and of that the true sun, that is both the solar anus and the bright Apollo, the Dionysian and the Apollonian united in one. It's such a intense one.
In the first slide, if you can go back to it, This sums up, I think, his life perfectly. The soul of some old poet haunts the drains and howls as if a ghost could hate the cold. I think that really describes his state of.
Yeah. He was haunted, right? He was haunted by Poe. He saw Poe as the ultimate spleen. And there he is haunting him in the shadow of the poet, you know? And you also see these periods of indolence where he's attacking himself for his boredom and his inability to act, right? He recognizes this necessity to be in the present, to be constantly transforming and to be challenging himself, yet he is incapable of facing this ugliness. And it's only through this art, this poetry, and the love of the other that he can do it. He has to gaze into the darkness in order to get out of bed. It's such a deep thing. And I felt like, to me, this is kind of the quintessential Baudelaire. Okay. Here he is as the alchemist who's desperate to heal the wounds of separation and become that whole self. And here he is reflecting upon the spleen in its utter darkness and depravity. So, wow. I wanted to include this one. This is a poem that caused him a lot of heartache. I see this very much in the vein of Byron, who was celebrating Lucifer. And as we saw earlier, he identifies the satanic with that Hermes and with that Saturn. These figures, these magical beings of transformation, as Satan being representative of this pan too, of the all, of that totality of experience that you have to confront and face. So this is one also that's been quoted by infinite number of metal bands and will appear in the lyrics of an infinite number of metal bands until metal is no longer an art form. Right? So, the litanies of Satan. O you, the most knowing and loveliest of angels, a god fate betrayed, deprived of praises. O Satan, take pity on my long misery. O prince of exiles, to whom wrong has been done, who vanquished always recovers more strongly. O Satan, take pity on my long misery. You who know everything, king of the underworld, the familiar healer of human distress. O Satan, take pity on my long misery. You who teach even lepers, accursed pariahs, through love itself the taste of paradise. O Satan, take pity on my long misery. O you who on death, your ancient true lover, engendered hope, that lunatic charmer. O Satan, take pity on my long misery. You who grant the condemned that calm, proud look, that damns a whole people crowding the scaffold. O Satan, take pity on my long misery. You who know in what corners of envious countries a jealous God hid those stones that are precious. O Satan, take pity on my long misery. You whose clear eye knows the deep caches where buried the race of metals slumber. O Satan, take pity on my long misery. You whose hands hide the precipice from the sleepwalker on the skyscraper's cliff. O Satan, take pity on my long misery. You who make magically supple the bones of the drunkard, out late, who's trampled by horses. O Satan, take pity on my long misery. You who taught us to mix saltpeter with sulfur, to console the frail human being who suffers. O Satan, take pity on my long misery. You who set your mark, O subtle accomplice, on the forehead of Croesus, the vile and pitiless. O Satan, take pity on my long misery. You who set in the hearts and eyes of young girls the cult of the wound, adoration of rags. O Satan, take pity on my long misery. The exile's staff, the light of invention, confessor to those to be hanged, to conspirators. O Satan, take pity on my long misery. Father, adopting those who God the Father drove in dark anger from earthly paradise. O Satan, take pity on my long misery.
Love the use of repetition.
It really becomes evocative, and it's a prayer, you know,
Yeah.
and you really like someone who, I grew up Catholic, so this is something that I really resonate, except I would be saying, oh, Jesus, have mercy on me, the sinner. That's the Jesus prayer, one of the most famous prayers there is. Jesus Christ, have mercy upon me, the sinner. And here he is, oh, Satan, take pity on my long misery.
I can picture in a synagogue or something, like almost chanting it like, "Oh Satan, take pity on my long misery," and everyone kind of mumbles along, and then that's a very big thing in the synagogues and stuff. Is kind of you hear the people sort of singing along in their own sort.
Isn't it a cantor? I think.
Yeah, the cantor, exactly.
And it makes me think of we've of songs like there's that song Synagogue of Satan. It's anyway. Yeah, definitely those long, droning, repetitive hymns. And you see similar things in the Catholic Church too, So it's very, very evocative of that orthodoxy, but it's an inversion. And I want people to notice the similarities to Byron and to specifically his Cain of Mystery. Right? He's doing a very similar thing where he's seeing Satan as this salvatory figure, as the one who brings reason and innovation, as the treasure finder, the one who can reveal where the gold is buried, where the jewels are hidden. This is also very evocative for those with ears to hear who are invested in the Greek of that Dionysus of the underworld, the Pluton, who hides the treasures, or Saturn, Kronos again, who is often propitiated to show us where the treasures are buried, And here, this figure that in the Christian sense is this ultimate evil, this ultimate figure of destruction, is the one who takes pity, is the one who gives, who bestows on us treasure and love, and who helps us to confront the self and create an earthly paradise as opposed to a heavenly one. I really thought that was profound, personally. So this is the last poem I wanted to do. And this one was brought to my attention by another friend on our Discord. So I want to give a shout out to Solar. He shared this, or I believe it was Solar. It could be another person. But either way, whoever shared this with me on the Discord, all praise to you. Thank you so much. I had missed this one somehow, but as we know, Kythera is an island, and it's the place where Aphrodite is said to be born, also known as Cyprus. So I love Aphrodite. Aphrodite is my favorite of the goddesses, practically, next to, of course, the personifications like Medea and Circe. So I had to include this. Here we go. A voyage to Kythera. My heart soared with joy, like a bird in flight, haunting the rigging, sliding by. The ship swayed under a cloudless sky like an angel dazed by radiant light. What island is that, dark and sad? Kythera. In verse, it's famous, you understand. Every aged child's golden land. Look, after all, there's nothing here. Isle of sweet secrets and heart's delight. Ancient Venus's marvelous shadow, like perfume, covers the sea around you, fills the mind with love and the languorous night. Isle of green myrtle and flowers wide open, beautiful, revered by every nation, where the sighs of the heart's adoration glide like incense over a rose garden, or are cooing like doves in scented air. Kythera, now a desert to mock, walk, full of piercing calls of barren rock. But I saw a strange thing there. It was not a temple shaded by trees where the young priestesses with flowers like desires, her body alight with secret fires, goes, opening her robes to the passing breeze, but a shore where our white sails moving by disturbed the birds, and we saw like jet the black of a cypress tree's silhouette, a three-branched gibbet against the sky, a fierce bird perching on the head of a hanged man, rent him surely, planting its impure beak in fury. In the bloody corners of the dead, the eyes were two holes. From the cavernous belly, the weight of his guts poured down his sides, and his torturers gorged on hideous delights and castrated him most efficiently. Beneath his feet, circling spurn a jealous pack, their muzzles lifted of whirling beasts, one large one, leaping in their midst, an executioner with cohorts at his back, inhabitants of Kithera, son of that lovely sky, you suffered their insults silently to expiate your infamy. Lacking the tomb of your crimes deny, hanged man, grotesque sufferer, your pain is mine. I felt at the sight of your dangling limbs the long stream of gall old sufferings rise to my teeth like acid bile. Before you, poor devil of dear memory, I felt all the breaks and ravening claws of swooping ravens, dark panthers' jaws that were once so fond of tearing at me. The sky was entrancing, so calm the sea, but to me all was dark and smeared with blood. Alas, my heart was buried for good in the depths, the winding sheet of an allegory. Oh, Venus, in your island what I found was just a symbolic gallows with my image in suspense. Oh God, give me the courage and the strength to contemplate my heart and body without disgust.
Wow.
What do you think of this one?
Very amazing. It's like it reminds me of like a pilgrimage, but then you aren't happy with what you discover at the end, you know?
Oh, definitely. And again, right, for those of us who are familiar with the Greek myths and the Greek stories, to me, this is evocative of the Amazonians, right? The people who, if you crashed upon their shores, they would string you up in gibbets and decapitate you and consume your flesh, turn you into the mysterious rites of sacrifice and use you, you know? He has become that sacrificial lamb. He's searching for her, and what does he find? Himself destroyed, dismembered, consumed.
Man.
Right? And it's also this recognition that he needs to go through this hanging. He needs to go through this destruction. He has to be consumed and rended by these women, by this Venus, by Aphrodite, in order to experience that beauty that exists beyond time, that bringer of balance, that affirmer of life, even in the darkness, even in that destruction of the self.
Yes, like the very last lines of the poem. Give me the courage and the strength to contemplate my heart and body without disgust. You know, it's like the radical acceptance.
Yep.
Of
You see, at the very end, what he discovers is that love of self, that absolute love, that absolute Aphrodite. And it took that destruction, that dismemberment, the rejection. He had to lose the self and see it laid bare in all of its ugliness before he could learn to appreciate it. And this is true of all of us who want to engage with that magic, that mystery. This is the process, right? This is that alchemical work that is at the center of all of Baudelaire's magic. You know? So I wanted to end on that one. And this is one of the last photos of his life, and this is his death mask. You know, there are so many poems I could have brought up. I could practically have read you the entire Fleur de Mal. That's how much magical imagery is present. And I know people in the comments are posting their favorites. and I'm sorry if I didn't get to them. I try to keep these episodes to 2 hours, and that is it's a long time and it's hard to do. So bear with me. If you have ones that you want us to engage with, post them on our Discord in the poetry section, and I will try to read them at least for the channel, because I loved Baudelaire, and I loved Baudelaire before, but going through this and engaging with him here, I feel like I really see him and appreciate him in all of his beauty and in all of his ugliness. You know, he is such an honest, self-critical man, and such a man driven by the excesses of passion. And as a person who's a lover of passion and art myself, I hard relate, and also relate with his life so much about this constant battle between the obsessive creation and then that self-hating idleness. You know, how do you feel about Baudelaire now?
I love him. Because he's approaching his writing from a magical perspective, similar to how Lutz Normal approached, the songs of Meldor, exposing the ugliness so that we can learn from it and transform with it,
Yep. And I want to highlight, with all of these figures that you and I have brought forward, there's this consistent theme of the double. I didn't select these people looking for that theme either in that language, yet each one of these magicians identifies the double, and identifies this necessity of the dode, the antidote, the balancing of the self, the confrontation of ugliness, the affirmation of life, and the learning you have to be self-critical, you have to embrace the now. All of these men and women have done so.
It's so true. I can really, as an artist myself, I can identify with the passionate frenzy of creation juxtaposed with the idleness and, the pain of not creating. But I think that not creating is an important aspect of creating, because it's like a gestation period where you're absorbing new influences and reflecting more on life so that you can create more.
Of course it's necessary, right? Like, we look at, there's huge periods of Baudelaire's life where he's just dedicating himself to the experience and appreciation of art. Had he not gone through that magical process of gaining that knowledge, he never would have been able to evoke the images that he evokes. He could not be the person that he becomes. He could never produce Le Fleur de Mal. And this is something that all great artists have to go through. And it's something that I think that a lot of us don't like to recognize, is that greatness requires an incredible amount of sacrifice and work and persistence and criticism. If you are going to become that magician, if you're going to do that alchemical work of balancing the self, it is not easy by any stretch, and it is a lifelong endeavor, and it is an endeavor unto death, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think even Baudelaire would recognize that he came up short in some respects. He was unable to be that ideal and to achieve that balance he's so called for,
It reminds me of, speaking of doubles, from The Theater and His Double by Artaud. He says, but no matter how loudly we clamor for magic in our lives, we're truly afraid to pursue an existence entirely under its influence and sign. And that's really what I feel with Baudelaire, is that he has this this idealized way of how we should perceive ourselves and embody ourselves, but he himself is afraid to make that last leap.
That's very, very true. That's very true, I think. And I think a lot of it too, you can see it in his writings to his mother, like he's still attached to the past, and to wanting to please her, and to these ideals of nobility and French high society. He can't let certain things go in order to embrace fully that magical transformative of action. He does, to an extent. Like, don't get me wrong, What he achieves is incredible, but we also have to acknowledge that that magical work fundamentally destroys him. He's not able to achieve that balance with his poisons, you know? And this is something you see with many, many magicians. I'm reminded of Crowley, you know, who in his hubris believed that he, as the grand magician, could not be controlled by drugs, that he was beyond the body. But this is something I think that Artaud intrinsically knew. We are the body. You know, the body is the self, and there is no self without the body.
Exactly.
And I think Crowley did to a certain extent too, but he really was all about embracing that power. You know, so much of the of being a magician, you have to become that person who sits upon the throne, who's certain and sure, who takes that leap into the unknown. And to be able to do that, to embrace that magical transformation, requires this ego, requires this sense of self, requires this ability to challenge and force. But that same kind of hubris that in one point is necessary needs to be challenged later on in the process, right?
Yeah, definitely. Otherwise, it leads to destruction of yourself and those around you.
Right. And I think the best thing about Baudelaire is that he created such incredible art that we can engage with, and that can really force you to stare into that abyss and see the ugliness, but it is transformed into beauty. The flowers of evil, that rotting corpse is Baudelaire's flower. Right? So I guess,
Right?
go ahead.
Putrescence blooms.
Putrescence blooms. So we'll leave it there. I think that's, unless you have any last words to discuss with Baudelaire.
I think that's
right.
Leave it.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. I highly recommend you all go read The Fleur de Mal. It's not a very long read. It's an engaging piece of literature, and all of the poems flow so well together and should ultimately be read as a whole. So please go down and like and subscribe. Come and join our Discord, support us on Patreon and Ko-fi. And also we have links below to all of Graham's work. If you want to support his poetry, his publication house, Things in My Chest, or his band, The Ghosts of Shadow Moses. So thank you so much. Any final words, Graham?
Love yourself and hail Satan.
Peace, love, hail Satan. Take care, everyone. Oh, almost forgot. Next week, we will be back, and we're going to be doing a contemporary artist, right?
I'm hoping so. I'm hoping I will be ready in time.
Okay, so we will see. We're either going to be doing a contemporary artist, or I'll be back with another classic. But we have been looking at this incredible work by a modern contemporary French artist. We've mentioned them on the channel before, Gaston Boucher. I highly recommend you all check out their work, Anarch, poetry and art of the highest order. And a modern magician engaged in that Negrito alchemy, that destructive alchemy, in a way that we need to talk about and we need to bring to your attention.
Yeah, there's so much covered in such a short piece of writing that I'm just a bit overwhelmed, but I think I'll be ready.
All right, everyone. We'll see you next week, hopefully with Gaston Boucher. All right. Peace, love, hail Satan, and until next time. Take care, my friends.